A billionaire was shocked to see his ex at his engagement party, and what she said destroyed him. Maximilian Donovan had worked tirelessly to build his empire from the ground up. A self-made billionaire, he was the epitome of success, a man who had crafted a life that many could only dream of. His penthouse, perched high above the city skyline, was a testament to his wealth and power. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows looked over a sprawling city of opportunity, a world that he had conquered. His cars were the finest, polished to perfection, and his presence at exclusive clubs and extravagant events only added to his larger-than-life persona. To the outside world, Maximilian was a man who had it all: wealth, success, and the admiration of everyone who crossed his path. His public image was flawless, self-assured, confident, and always in control. And then there was Chloe Edwards, his fiancée, the perfect counterpart to his perfectly constructed life. She was beautiful, poised, and from a family that only added to Maximilian's sense of status and power. Together, they were seen as the ultimate power couple, their engagement the crowning jewel in a life that seemed untouched by any real problems. They were the couple that everyone envied, their relationship a seamless blend of success and social prestige. Chloe, with her unwavering confidence and flawless appearance, made it clear to the world that she was Maximilian's perfect match. Their life, on paper, appeared to be an unblemished reflection of happiness. But underneath the surface, Maximilian was starting to feel the cost of his success. He had built an empire, but in the process, he had built walls around himself. His ambition had made him a stranger to those around him, including Chloe. He had become emotionally detached, unable to connect with her on a deeper level. His career consumed him, leaving little room for vulnerability or true intimacy. Though Chloe was everything he could have asked for, beautiful, intelligent, and from a prestigious family, there was something missing. Maximilian couldn't share his fears, his insecurities, or even his desires with her. Their conversations were polite, surface level, and while they shared a mutual respect, there was an emotional chasm between them that neither could bridge. The deeper part of him, the part that craved connection, was buried under layers of ambition and pride. He could not express what he truly needed, not even to the woman he was supposed to marry. Maximilian's mind, however, was not entirely focused on the life he had so carefully constructed. There was someone else, a name that haunted him despite his best efforts to bury it: Isabella Hart. Their past had been passionate, a whirlwind of love and creativity, but it had ended in heartbreak. Maximilian's heart had once been consumed by Isabella, but in the end, his ambition had driven them apart. Now, years later, her memory lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him with unresolved feelings. He tried to push them away, tried to remind himself that Isabella was part of a past that no longer mattered. But her presence in his thoughts was inescapable. The guilt and regret were buried deep, but they never quite disappeared, only resurfacing in moments of solitude, when Maximilian could no longer ignore the fact that he had left her behind without ever truly letting go. Chloe, in contrast, was thrilled about their upcoming engagement party. She poured herself into the planning with a passion that matched her belief in their perfect future. Every detail was meticulously arranged, from the guest list to the decor, all designed to showcase Maximilian's success and the strength of their union. Chloe was convinced that their love was the culmination of everything they had worked for, that their engagement was the final piece of a life that was destined for greatness. Her excitement was infectious, and she saw the event as a celebration of their love story, a story that was meant to be an example to the world of what true success looked like. For her, there was no question. This party would solidify their place at the top, a declaration to everyone that Maximilian and Chloe Donovan were untouchable. Maximilian, however, felt a growing sense of unease as the date of the party drew closer. He tried to mask his discomfort behind a smile, going through the motions of supporting Chloe's vision for their perfect celebration. But deep down, something was stirring inside him, something that made him question whether this was the life he truly wanted. It wasn't the party itself that troubled him. It was the illusion of perfection it represented. He had spent years building his wealth, his reputation, and his relationship with Chloe. But as the pieces fell into place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The party was meant to celebrate everything he had achieved, yet it felt like an elaborate mask he had created to hide the truth from himself. The grand event was a symbol of his success, but it didn't fill the emptiness inside of him. Maximilian had everything he could ever want, except the one thing he had lost sight of: genuine connection. To Chloe, the party was a symbol of their future. To Maximilian, it was a reminder of how far he had strayed from what truly mattered. He had built an empire, but in doing so, he had neglected the one thing that made life worth living: love. As Chloe continued to pour her energy into making the event perfect, Maximilian couldn't help but feel trapped in a life that no longer felt authentic. His doubts were mounting, but he couldn't bring himself to voice them. Chloe was happy, the world was watching, and he had everything he could ever ask for. Yet, the more he tried to embrace the perfection of his life, the more his discontent grew. As the date of the party approached, Maximilian's feelings of disconnection became impossible to ignore. He stood alone in his penthouse, looking out at the city he had conquered, but for the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The life he had built, the life he had thought would bring him happiness, now seemed like a gilded cage. He had everything the world told him he should want, but inside, he felt more isolated than ever. It was as if all the achievements and material success had not brought him closer to fulfillment, but had only pulled him further away from the emotional depth he craved. The engagement, the party, the outward perfection, they were all part of a world he no longer felt connected to. And as Maximilian stood in the silence of his penthouse, the unease in his heart grew stronger, setting the stage for the emotional unraveling that was soon to follow. As the days passed and the engagement party drew nearer, Maximilian's restlessness grew more pronounced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the life he had built was slipping through his fingers, that the people around him were merely playing their parts in a life he no longer recognized as his own. Chloe's enthusiasm only intensified his discomfort. She was so deeply invested in the idea of a perfect future, a future that fit neatly into the mold of societal expectations. The party, with its dazzling guest list and extravagant details, seemed like the pinnacle of that perfect life. Yet Maximilian felt an increasing sense of detachment from it all, like an actor performing on a stage, wearing a mask he had long since outgrown. The facade of their engagement, the sparkling rings, the whispers of admiration from their friends and colleagues, all of it felt hollow. Maximilian could see it now, clearer than ever before. The admiration from the world, the validation from society, had never truly satisfied him. He had spent years building this empire, chasing success like a man possessed, but it had come at a price. The price of his own happiness. And yet, he couldn't shake the fear of confronting the reality of his own disillusionment. What would he do if he let go of the perfection he had so carefully crafted? What would be left if he stopped pretending to be the man he had convinced everyone he was? The nights became restless, filled with endless contemplation. Maximilian would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, hearing the sounds of the city below but feeling completely alone. His life was on display for the world to see, yet no one knew the emptiness that lingered inside him. He had built walls around his emotions, and now those walls were closing in, trapping him in a world that no longer made sense. Chloe, for all her beauty and charm, couldn't fill the space where true emotional connection should have been. She was a fixture in his life, a well-positioned piece in the grand design of his success, but she was not the one he longed to connect with. Isabella's memory would not leave him. Every corner of his mind seemed to hold fragments of their past, moments of laughter, shared dreams, and the warmth of a love he had allowed to slip through his fingers. Isabella had been different from Chloe, different from anyone he had ever known. She had understood him in ways that no one else could. Her presence had awakened something in him, a side of himself he had buried deep under layers of ambition and pride. And now, years later, her absence felt like a wound that would never fully heal. Despite his attempts to bury the past, Isabella's shadow loomed over him, growing stronger with each passing day. The memory of her became more vivid in his mind, more painful. He remembered the way her eyes had sparkled when she spoke of her art, the way she had made him feel alive in a way that wealth and success never could. He remembered the love they had shared, and how he had sacrificed it all for the pursuit of his own ambitions. Maximilian couldn't deny the truth any longer. He had let her go, and in doing so, he had lost something more precious than any of the material wealth he had accumulated. Chloe, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil inside Maximilian. She continued to dream of their perfect life, planning the engagement party with an intensity that reflected her belief that everything was as it should be. She envisioned their future as a flawless continuation of the present, a life built on their shared success and status. But Maximilian could no longer play along. The more he saw Chloe's excitement, the more he realized how deeply out of touch they had become with one another. He couldn't bring himself to share his doubts with her, not when she was so invested in their image of perfection. And so, he stayed silent, watching as the party loomed on the horizon, a symbol of a future he no longer wanted. It was in this silence that Maximilian began to confront the truth about himself. His life, though outwardly perfect, had become a carefully constructed lie. The engagement party, which was supposed to be a celebration of their future, had become a prison of his own making. His mind was filled with contradictions, torn between the image he had built for himself and the man he had become. He could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that he was living a life that was not his own, a life that had been shaped by others' expectations rather than his own desires. As the night of the party drew closer, Maximilian found himself facing a crisis. He stood at the precipice of a life he had once thought he wanted, but now realized was empty. The wealth, the fame, the adoration of the world, they no longer held any meaning. What had once driven him now seemed trivial in comparison to the deeper truths he had long since ignored. Isabella, the one he had lost, had left a hole in his heart that no amount of success could fill. And Chloe, though she represented everything he had thought he needed, could not offer him the emotional depth that he now craved. Maximilian's emotional turmoil was palpable, a storm brewing beneath the surface of his flawless exterior. His world, once so carefully curated, was beginning to crack, revealing the emptiness that lay beneath. The engagement party was no longer just a social event. It had become the ultimate test of his life. Would he continue to live the lie, clinging to the image of perfection he had worked so hard to build? Or would he find the courage to face the truth, to acknowledge the emptiness inside him, and to confront the love he had lost? The stage was set for a collision of past and present, of dreams and reality. The life Maximilian had worked so hard to create was unraveling, and with it came the chance for redemption or destruction. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The perfect life he had so carefully crafted was no longer enough. Maximilian would have to face the truth of who he really was, and in doing so, he would have to confront the ghosts of his past, the very things he had been trying to outrun for so long. The party, the engagement, the perfect future, all of it was just a mask, and Maximilian was finally ready to take it off. This is the moment where everything changes. Isabella had spent years building a life of quiet solitude, pouring her pain into her art and becoming known for her emotionally charged works. She was reclusive, fiercely protective of her personal life, and shied away from the public eye despite her growing prominence in the art world. Her reputation as a talented and evocative artist spread like wildfire, but Isabella had no desire to bask in the spotlight. Fame, she had learned, was empty and shallow, much like the life she once shared with Maximilian. She had channeled her heartbreak into her paintings, each stroke of the brush an attempt to heal the wounds he had left behind. Yet, no matter how far she pushed herself into her work, no matter how many accolades she received, there was a part of her that remained broken. The memories of Maximilian haunted her, lurking in the back of her mind, like ghosts that refused to leave. Their breakup had been nothing short of devastating, a slow unraveling of everything they once shared. The man she had loved so deeply had become a stranger, someone more focused on his empire than on the woman who had once been at his side. Isabella tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. The love they had shared had been intense, all-encompassing, but in the end, it had felt like it was always just out of reach. The betrayal, the lies, and the eventual abandonment had left scars on her heart that no amount of success could erase. Her emotions were a tangled mess: love, bitterness, betrayal, each one fighting for dominance, but none of them ever truly fading. And now, as she looked at the invitations to her upcoming exhibition, the thought of confronting her past, of seeing him again, was both terrifying and tempting. The letter came unexpectedly. Chloe Edwards, Maximilian's fiancée, sent an invitation to Isabella's latest exhibit, praising her work and inviting her to the grand engagement party. Chloe, it seemed, had no idea of the history between Isabella and Maximilian, nor the wounds that still lingered. She admired Isabella's artistry and wanted her to be a part of the celebration. For a moment, Isabella stared at the invitation, conflicted. A part of her wanted to tear it up, to pretend it had never arrived. She had spent so long running from her past, from Maximilian, that the thought of walking into that world again felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought to build. But another part of her, a curious and vulnerable part, wondered what it would feel like to see him again, to finally understand why it had all ended the way it did. Could she confront the past? Could she move on, once and for all? The decision wasn't easy. Isabella wrestled with herself for days, each moment torn between the desire to remain in her safe, reclusive world and the need for closure. Her art had given her a purpose, a reason to keep going, but there was a nagging emptiness she couldn't ignore. The past still haunted her, and she knew that avoiding it forever would only prolong the pain. When she finally made up her mind, it wasn't out of a desire for reconciliation or love. It was about closure. She would attend the party, face her past, and move on. She would no longer let Maximilian's shadow dictate her future. As Isabella arrived at the engagement party, her heart pounded in her chest. The opulence of the venue, the polished guests, the expensive champagne, it was all so foreign to her now. She had spent so long away from this world, from Maximilian's world, that it felt like stepping into another life altogether. The memories of their time together crept back, unbidden, with each step she took through the grand hall. There was the familiarity of it all, the laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, but also the sharp sting of how much she had lost. She felt exposed, like a piece of art being observed by strangers, but she had no choice but to move forward. This was her decision. She would no longer be defined by the pain of the past, even if it hurt to face it. Maximilian had been unaware of her presence, his mind preoccupied with the excitement of the night and his impending future with Chloe. But the moment he saw Isabella, everything stopped. His heart skipped a beat, and the world around him seemed to blur. She looked the same, yet so different. Time had etched new lines into her face, but it was her eyes that caught him. Those eyes, once filled with love and trust, now held something else, something he couldn't quite place. He wasn't ready to confront her, not here, not in front of everyone. But he couldn't tear his gaze away. Memories flooded back, memories of a love he had destroyed, of a woman who had once meant everything to him. The emotional turmoil was instant: surprise, longing, guilt, and a deep, aching desire to reach out to her. Isabella, on the other hand, had spent years building walls around herself, learning to protect her heart from the world, from Maximilian. She had promised herself she would never let him hurt her again. But seeing him now, standing across the room, those walls began to crumble. Her composure remained intact, but inside, she was a storm. The years of emotional scars, of unresolved feelings, rushed to the surface. She had long ago convinced herself that she was over him, that she had moved on. But in that moment, she realized how deeply she still felt for him. How could she not? He had been her everything once. But that was the past, and she couldn't afford to fall back into the same trap. She had to stay detached, to remain strong. The tension between them was electric, palpable. Neither could escape the pull of their past, but neither was ready to confront it. They exchanged glances, brief and loaded with emotion, but neither made a move. Maximilian watched her from afar, consumed by curiosity and guilt. How had she changed? What was she thinking? And what had become of the woman he had loved? Isabella, too, observed him, but from a distance. She watched the way he interacted with Chloe, the way his eyes flickered with unease when he thought no one was looking. Did he feel the same? Was he as tortured by their past as she was? As the night wore on, Maximilian found himself drawn to her more and more. He couldn't resist watching her, trying to piece together the woman who had once been his everything. He wanted to understand how she had moved on, how she had built such a life for herself while he had stumbled through his own. There was something about her that captivated him, something he couldn't ignore. But every time he tried to approach her, something held him back. The past was too heavy, the weight of it too great to carry in this moment. So, instead, he lingered in the shadows, watching wondering if he would ever be able to make amends. Isabella, too, was battling her emotions. She told herself that attending the party was about moving forward, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She had come here to face the past, to find closure. But the moment she laid eyes on Maximilian, everything she had worked for seemed to unravel. The anger, the bitterness, the questions, all of it surged back. Why had he left her? Why had he thrown away their love? And could she ever forgive him for what he had done? As the night wore on, her resolve began to falter. The past was no longer something she could avoid. It was standing in front of her, in the form of the man she had once loved. Their first conversation was inevitable, but it was far from what either of them expected. Awkward and charged with years of unspoken emotions, the exchange was brief but intense. Maximilian tried to speak, to say something, anything, but Isabella was guarded, careful not to let him see how deeply he still affected her. Their words were polite, surface level, but the weight of their history hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Neither was willing to fully confront the truth, but both were aware that this moment was significant. It was a beginning, of sorts, but neither knew what the future would hold. And so, they continued to avoid each other throughout the party, despite the magnetic pull between them. The emotional distance between them grew, an invisible barrier neither could cross. Maximilian wanted to reach out, to apologize, to make things right, but the fear of rejection kept him at bay. Isabella, too, was unwilling to show her vulnerability, unwilling to let him see the pain he had caused. But the tension was palpable, and by the end of the night, both knew they had come to a crossroads. Would they continue to dance around the past, or would they finally confront it? The tension that hung in the air between them deepened as the evening continued. Maximilian watched Isabella, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts he couldn't quite process. He wanted to apologize, to say something meaningful, but the words felt inadequate. Every time he tried to approach her, to bridge the distance that had formed between them, something held him back. Fear, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of regret. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to manipulate them in his favor. But this was different. This was a woman he had loved and lost, and the power he once had over her had long since disappeared. Isabella, too, found herself trapped in a whirlwind of emotions. She had told herself she was over him, that his betrayal no longer haunted her. But as she watched him from across the room, that familiar ache in her chest returned. It wasn't just the pain of their breakup. It was the pain of never having truly understood what went wrong. Why had he chosen his empire over her? Why had he let her go so easily? These were the questions that had haunted her for years, unanswered, unresolved. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, looking at her with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the past. How could she possibly face him after everything? The night wore on, and the party continued without a hitch. But for Maximilian and Isabella, it was as though time had stopped. Every glance they exchanged, every fleeting moment of connection, was fraught with unspoken words. They were both stuck in the past, both unwilling to confront it directly, yet unable to escape it. The more Maximilian observed her, the more he realized just how much he had lost. The woman before him was not the same person he had known. The fire in her eyes, the quiet strength in her demeanor, the way she carried herself with such confidence. It was all so different, and yet so familiar. He wanted to know everything about her, to understand how she had become the person she was, but every time he tried to step closer, he was met with resistance. Isabella, on the other hand, struggled with the same internal battle. She had built a life for herself, one that no longer depended on Maximilian. But in the back of her mind, he still lingered. It was impossible to ignore the impact he had had on her life, even after all these years. She had moved on, yes, but there was a part of her that still longed for the version of herself she had been when she was with him. The woman who had believed in their future, in their love. But that woman was gone, and Isabella had become someone else, someone stronger, someone more self-reliant. The pain of the past still lingered, but she refused to let it define her. She had built herself up again, piece by piece, and she wouldn't let Maximilian tear it all down. Their first conversation, when it finally came, was nothing like they had both imagined. It was brief, awkward, and laden with so much unspoken history that neither knew how to navigate it. Maximilian had tried to speak, to break the silence between them, but Isabella had been cautious, distant, unwilling to let him in. She could feel the old emotions stirring inside her, but she fought to keep them in check. She couldn't let him have that power over her again, not after everything he had done. Maximilian had been prepared for a cold reception, but he hadn't expected to feel the weight of her indifference so acutely. He had hoped, foolishly, that time would have healed their wounds, that they could move past the pain they had caused each other. But it was clear from their exchange that the wounds were still fresh, still raw. Isabella's guardedness, her refusal to open up, was a clear sign that she wasn't ready to forgive him. And deep down, Maximilian knew he didn't deserve forgiveness. Not yet. The apology he had rehearsed in his mind felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to undo the damage he had caused. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-glances and awkward silences. Maximilian and Isabella remained on opposite sides of the room, their paths rarely crossing, but the tension between them never dissipated. Both of them were aware of the weight of the moment, of the significance of what they had just experienced. They had seen each other again, faced the ghosts of their past, but nothing had changed. They were still trapped in the same emotional prison they had been in all those years ago, only now there was a new layer of pain, a new layer of regret. As the night drew to a close, the reality of the situation set in. Isabella had faced her past, had confronted Maximilian in a way she had never thought possible. But it hadn't been enough. She had come to the party in search of closure, but all she had found was more questions. The unresolved feelings, the anger, the betrayal, none of it had been addressed. And Maximilian, despite his desire to make things right, had been too afraid to truly confront her. His fear of rejection, his guilt over the way he had treated her, had prevented him from doing what needed to be done. Isabella left the party that night with the same sense of emptiness she had felt when she first arrived. The decision to attend had been a step toward healing, but it had only brought more pain. The man she had once loved was still a stranger, and the answers she had sought for so long were still out of reach. Maximilian, too, left the party with a heavy heart. His eyes followed Isabella as she disappeared into the night, and for the first time in years, he realized how deeply he still cared for her. But the truth was, he had never truly let her go, not in his heart. And now, as he stood there, alone in the midst of the celebrations, he knew that the past could not be buried so easily. It would take more than just a glance, more than just a fleeting conversation, to heal the wounds they had inflicted on each other. And so, as the night ended and the guests departed, both Maximilian and Isabella were left to confront their pasts in silence. The unresolved tension, the unspoken emotions, lingered in the air, like a promise, one neither of them was ready to fulfill. They were still trapped, still caught in the web of their shared history. But neither was willing to give up just yet. Maximilian's mind raced as the night dragged on. Each time he glanced at Isabella from across the room, a wave of confusion and guilt overwhelmed him. He had thought that his life with Chloe, the perfect engagement, the public adoration, would be enough to fill the emptiness inside of him. But now, it felt hollow. He had spent so many years building this empire, pushing everything and everyone away, only to realize that none of it could fill the space that Isabella had once occupied in his heart. Her presence was like a weight pressing down on him, reminding him of the love he had abandoned for success, the woman he had let slip away for the sake of ambition. Chloe, ever the attentive fiancée, noticed his distracted behavior. She caught him staring at Isabella on more than one occasion, his brow furrowed, his expression unreadable. "Max, are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. He forced a smile, brushing it off as nerves from the event, but Chloe wasn't convinced. Her intuition told her that something was wrong, something deeper than just pre-party jitters. Maximilian was slipping away from her, and she could feel it. Every time she tried to draw him back into the celebration, to anchor him in the present moment, his mind seemed to drift elsewhere. He would smile politely, nod along to her conversations, but there was a distance between them that couldn't be ignored. As the evening wore on, Chloe's frustration grew. Was this just the stress of the night, or was there something more? She couldn't help but wonder if Maximilian's coldness was a sign of something deeper, something that had been festering for a long time. She wanted to ask him directly, to confront him about the growing distance between them, but a part of her feared what the answer might be. Was he having second thoughts about their engagement? Was he still haunted by his past with Isabella? She pushed those thoughts aside, unwilling to let them take root, but they lingered in the back of her mind, making her more uneasy with each passing minute. Maximilian couldn't stop thinking about Isabella. Every time he looked at her, he felt the pull of their past, a connection that was impossible to ignore. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, to make rational decisions. But this was different. This wasn't about business or success. This was about love, something he had neglected for so long. Isabella had been a part of his life, a part of his heart, and now she was a ghost haunting him at the very celebration of his future with Chloe. He had tried to bury those feelings, to convince himself that his life with Chloe was the perfect life, the one he had worked so hard for. But as Isabella stood there, cold and composed, he realized that the life he had built had come at the cost of something irreplaceable. Isabella, for her part, was equally torn. She had moved on, or so she had convinced herself. She had built a life without Maximilian, one that didn't depend on him or his approval. She had thrown herself into her art, finding solace in creating, in expressing the emotions she had buried for so long. But seeing Maximilian again, after all these years, was a shock to her system. Despite her success, despite the life she had built for herself, the memories of their relationship resurfaced, raw and unrelenting. She had never truly healed, never fully forgiven him for the way he had treated her, for the way he had let their love slip through his fingers in favor of his ambition. But she had convinced herself that she didn't need him, that she was better off without him. And yet, as the night wore on, the emotions she had locked away came flooding back, making it harder and harder to remain composed. Maximilian and Isabella's silent standoff continued, the tension between them palpable. Neither was willing to approach the other, both afraid of what their conversation would uncover. Maximilian's discomfort grew with each passing moment. He wanted to speak to her, to ask her what had happened, to apologize for the pain he had caused, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The guilt was suffocating, and he wasn't sure he could face the truth. What if she hated him? What if he had ruined everything beyond repair? The pull of the past was so strong, but his desire to protect the life he had built with Chloe kept him rooted in place. He couldn't let it all slip away, not now, not after all the years of hard work and sacrifice. Isabella, too, felt the weight of their shared history. She had spent so long running from her feelings for Maximilian, trying to convince herself that she was better off without him. But now, in his presence, she couldn't help but feel the old ache in her chest, the longing for the version of herself she had been when they were together. She had been young, hopeful, and naive, believing that their love was enough to withstand anything. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. Maximilian had chosen his empire over her, over them, and she had been left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. And then, as the party continued, a moment of solitude arrived. Maximilian and Isabella found themselves alone, away from the festivities, in a quiet corner of the room. The noise of the celebration seemed distant, muffled, as the two of them stood there, facing each other for the first time in years. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the weight of all the things they had never said. Maximilian opened his mouth, unsure of where to begin, but the words felt inadequate, stuck in his throat. Isabella, however, had no such hesitation. She had made up her mind. It was time to face the truth, to confront the man who had once been her everything. Isabella's voice was soft, but her words cut through the air like a blade. She spoke of the emotional neglect she had suffered during their relationship, how Maximilian's career and ambition had always come first, leaving her in the shadows, waiting for his attention. She described the loneliness she had felt, the isolation that came with loving a man who was so consumed by his work that he could never truly be present for her. The bitterness and sadness in her voice were palpable as she recalled the times when she had tried to reach out to him, only to be met with indifference or dismissal. And then, as the conversation grew more intense, Isabella revealed the truth that Maximilian had never known. Her decision to leave him hadn't been about his neglect alone. It had been about his infidelity. Maximilian's face went pale as the weight of her words sank in. She told him about the women he had been with during their relationship, how she had discovered his betrayal and the crushing pain it had caused her. Her voice wavered with hurt and disbelief as she described the moment she had realized that their relationship had never been equal, that Maximilian had sought comfort elsewhere while she had waited for him to love her. Maximilian stood frozen, unable to respond. The guilt and shame washed over him in waves, each wave more suffocating than the last. He had never fully understood the depth of his neglect, never truly grasped how deeply he had hurt Isabella. As the realization settled in, a cold dread spread through his chest. His world, the empire he had spent so many years building, seemed so insignificant now. What was the point of all his wealth, all his success, if he had lost the one thing that had truly mattered? Her love. He had taken her for granted, assumed she would always be there, always wait for him. And now, he understood the extent of his arrogance. Isabella's words were the final blow. "You never really loved me, Maximilian. Not the way I loved you." She stood her ground, no longer seeking reconciliation or closure, but simply confronting him with the painful truth. There was no room for apologies now. She had made her peace with the past, but it didn't change the fact that their love was irreparably broken. She turned and walked away, leaving Maximilian alone in the empty space, his heart shattered into pieces. Maximilian stood there, paralyzed by the weight of his actions. He could hear the distant hum of the party, but it felt so far away, as if he were in a different world altogether. His mind raced, but he couldn't focus on anything except the reality of what he had lost. Isabella was gone, and with her, the chance for redemption, for healing. He was alone, consumed by the realization that no amount of success or power could ever fill the void she had left behind. As the night wore on, Maximilian's guilt turned to despair. He looked around the party, the celebration of his engagement to Chloe, but it all felt meaningless now. The life he had worked so hard to create seemed so small compared to the love he had once shared with Isabella. It was a bitter realization, one that he could never undo. He had lost her, and with her, the chance to be the man he had once been. Maximilian's thoughts spiraled as the weight of Isabella's words settled deeper within him. The reality of what he had lost was unbearable. He stood frozen in that moment of solitude, the buzz of the party still echoing faintly in the background. But it felt like a distant memory, a life that no longer belonged to him. Everything he had worked for, the empire, the accolades, the perfect engagement with Chloe, none of it mattered. His mind replayed the painful truth. He had chosen his ambition over love, over the one person who had truly cared for him. And now, in the wake of Isabella's departure, he was left with nothing but the hollow remnants of a life he had thought he wanted. His chest tightened as guilt and regret consumed him. His hands trembled slightly, the reality of his actions almost too much to bear. How could he have been so blind? How could he have been so selfish? The pain of losing Isabella was far more intense than any business deal, any moment of triumph in the boardroom. She had been the one person who had truly seen him, loved him, and he had destroyed that. The guilt gnawed at him as he scanned the room, the people celebrating around him, oblivious to the internal collapse he was undergoing. Chloe was out there somewhere, probably still waiting for him to return to her side, to give her the attention she deserved. But he couldn't even bring himself to look at her. How could he? He had been so caught up in the illusion of his perfect life that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. Isabella's face, her pain, her betrayal, burned in his memory, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. He had already lost her. He had already lost his chance to be the man he once was, the man who could have loved her with all his heart. Chloe, meanwhile, had returned to the party, her mind still racing with uncertainty. She had tried to hold on to the hope that Maximilian's coldness was simply party nerves, a passing phase. But the more she observed him, the more she realized how distant he had become. She had always known that he carried a certain weight from his past, but she never imagined it would come to this. Now, as she caught sight of him standing off to the side, his eyes haunted and distant, something inside her snapped. She could feel the tension between them, a fracture that was impossible to ignore. She approached him slowly, her steps hesitant as she reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Maximilian," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet concern. "Are you sure you're all right? You've been distant all evening." She could feel the coldness in his response, the way he avoided meeting her eyes. For a moment, she felt a pang of fear. Was this what she had feared all along? That Maximilian's heart had never fully been hers. That perhaps there was something, or someone, he had never let go of? Maximilian turned toward her, his eyes clouded with a mixture of guilt and despair. He tried to smile, but it was hollow, lacking the warmth it once held. "I'm fine," he said, his voice strained. "Just tired, I guess." He hated himself for lying to her, for giving her the same shallow response he had given her so many times in the past. But the truth was too painful, too raw to confront. He had already broken her heart once, and he couldn't bring himself to do it again. Not tonight, not in front of everyone. Chloe, however, wasn't convinced. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the tension in his posture. "Max, please. If something's wrong, you can tell me," she pressed, her hand tightening on his arm. "I don't want us to keep pretending everything is fine if it's not." Her voice trembled slightly, the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide breaking through. She had always been the one to hold everything together, to be the rock in their relationship. But now, with Maximilian slipping away from her, she felt herself unraveling. Maximilian opened his mouth to respond, but the words got stuck. He wanted to tell her everything, the guilt, the regret, the way he had failed both of them, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the crowd, his mind miles away from the conversation. Chloe's words felt distant, muffled. The weight of his own mistakes was too much to bear, and he couldn't share it with her. Not now, not when he had already failed her so deeply. Chloe's frustration deepened. She stepped back slightly, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "I don't understand, Maximilian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're shutting me out. I've been patient with you. I've tried to understand. But I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." She turned to leave, not wanting to make a scene, but the sadness in her eyes was impossible to hide. Maximilian watched her walk away, the pain in her eyes cutting through him like a knife. He wanted to go after her, to apologize, to tell her that he wasn't shutting her out. But the words wouldn't come. He had already hurt her too much. He had already broken their connection, just like he had broken the connection with Isabella. What good would it do to try and fix things now? He had no answers, no way to undo the damage he had caused. The night dragged on, the hours stretching out like an eternity. Maximilian found himself alone again, standing at the edge of the party, a spectator to a life that no longer felt like his own. The guests continued to dance and laugh, oblivious to the emotional wreckage left in his wake. Isabella's absence felt like a hole in his chest, a black void that he couldn't escape from. He had tried to fill it with success, with ambition, with Chloe, but none of it mattered. He had lost the one person who had truly loved him, the one person who had seen him for who he was, not for what he could offer. He could feel his world crumbling, the foundation of his life shifting beneath him. The more he tried to rebuild it, the more it slipped through his fingers. Isabella had been his anchor, and now she was gone. Chloe, for all her love, could never replace her. Maximilian understood, deep in his soul, that his empire, his wealth, his social status, they meant nothing without the love he had once had. And in that moment, standing alone in the midst of the celebration, he realized that he had lost everything that truly mattered. The party continued, but for Maximilian, it was over. He had already faced the worst possible loss, the loss of love. And now, all he could do was live with the weight of that loss, the understanding that no amount of success could ever fill the emptiness he had created. Maximilian returned to his mansion after the party, the weight of Isabella's words still hanging heavily over him. He wandered aimlessly through the vast halls of his luxurious home, the emptiness echoing with each step he took. It should have been a sanctuary, but instead, it felt like a tomb, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. His empire, his wealth, the life he had built, all of it seemed hollow now. The faces of the people he surrounded himself with were like shadows, fleeting and distant. Nothing could fill the space where Isabella had once been. He replayed the moments of their relationship over and over, the times he had been too absorbed in his career to notice her pain, the times he had failed her without even realizing it. Guilt gripped him like a vice, squeezing his chest until he could hardly breathe. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let her slip away, all the while thinking he was doing what was best for them? The emotional weight of his actions consumed him, and he found himself lost in the fog of his own mind, unable to escape the crushing regret. The more he thought about Isabella, the more the realization sank in that he had missed the signs of her suffering, her loneliness, her quiet desperation for his attention. He had been too caught up in his ambition, too focused on building something that he thought would bring fulfillment, not realizing that what he truly needed was already within his grasp. And now, she was gone. His relationship with Chloe, which had once seemed like a perfect fit, now felt like a lie. He couldn't even bring himself to look at her without seeing Isabella's face. Chloe deserved someone who could love her, who could give her the attention and commitment she needed, and Maximilian knew he was no longer that person. The dichotomy of his life, his engagement to Chloe versus his lingering feelings for Isabella, was becoming too much to bear. His attempts to engage with Chloe were mechanical, forced. He tried, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Isabella, to the love he had lost. Every time he looked at Chloe, he felt like a stranger, like he was betraying her just by being there. His wealth, his status, his achievements, they had never filled the emotional void left by Isabella. He had built his life on ambition, duty, and a desire to be the best, but none of it mattered now. None of it could bring him peace, could undo the damage he had caused. Chloe began to notice the distance growing between them. She could see it in the way Maximilian's gaze would wander when she spoke to him, the way his mind seemed elsewhere even when he was physically present. At first, she had chalked it up to the stress of the party, the pressure of the engagement, but as days passed, it became impossible to ignore. He was withdrawing from her, emotionally shutting down, and the hurt she felt grew with each passing day. She tried to talk to him, tried to reach him, but Maximilian remained a distant figure, incapable of sharing what was truly going on inside. The more he refused to open up, the more Chloe's frustration mounted. She couldn't understand why he was shutting her out, why he was pulling away from the relationship they had worked so hard to build. One evening, after another strained silence between them, Chloe confronted Maximilian. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She demanded the truth, the answers she had been seeking for so long. But Maximilian, unable to explain the chaos swirling inside him, offered vague and unsatisfactory responses. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain the guilt, the regret, the emotional destruction he was experiencing, but the words wouldn't come. Chloe's eyes filled with tears as the reality hit her. Maximilian was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. He was lost, consumed by the ghosts of his past, and there was nothing left of the person she thought she knew. The emotional breakdown was inevitable. She finally admitted what she had been avoiding for so long. They were no longer a match. They had grown apart, and no amount of pretending could fix that. With a broken heart, Chloe ended their engagement, telling Maximilian that she deserved someone who could truly love her, someone who could give her the emotional connection that she needed. Maximilian stood frozen as the words sank in. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had failed, and now the life he had carefully constructed was crumbling before him. His world, the perfect image of success he had worked so hard to maintain, was shattered. The realization that he had lost Chloe, just as he had lost Isabella, was a blow that left him numb. He watched her walk away, her silhouette fading into the distance, and felt as though a part of him died with her. Now alone in his mansion, Maximilian was left to face the wreckage of his life. The silence in the house was deafening, the emptiness unbearable. He couldn't escape it, couldn't hide from the fact that he had no one left to turn to. All the people he had surrounded himself with, the colleagues, the business partners, the acquaintances, none of them truly knew him. None of them could offer the connection, the understanding, that he had lost. He had spent so many years building a fortress around himself, a life that was impressive on the outside but empty within. He had pushed everyone away, including Isabella, and now there was no one left. His mind kept returning to her, to the love they had shared. He had taken it all for granted, thinking he could always come back to her when the time was right. But the time was gone, and so was she. Meanwhile, Isabella, in the aftermath of their confrontation, had begun the long and painful process of healing. She threw herself into her art, using it as a way to channel her emotions, to express the heartbreak and anger she felt. Her work began to take on a deeper, more raw emotional tone, reflecting the turmoil she had experienced. Despite her efforts to move on, there were moments when the pain of their past crept back into her heart. The scars were still there, but she refused to let them define her. Isabella was determined to grow, to build a life for herself that wasn't tied to Maximilian or the betrayal he had caused her. She found strength in her independence, in her work, and in the recognition she began to receive for her art. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of fulfillment, a sense of purpose that had been missing during her time with Maximilian. Maximilian, in his isolation, began to understand the depth of his loss. He had lost more than just Isabella. He had lost the ability to truly connect with anyone, to build meaningful relationships. His wealth, his success, his empire, they meant nothing without love. He had thought that if he built enough, achieved enough, he would be fulfilled. But he now realized that his choices had cost him everything that truly mattered. His empire was nothing without love. And as he sat alone in the mansion that had once been his pride, he realized that he had no one left to share it with. The isolation was suffocating, and the loneliness was a constant reminder of the price he had paid for his ambition. Isabella, in contrast, had found a sense of closure. Through her art and her personal growth, she had begun to let go of the past. The pain was still there, but it no longer held her captive. She understood now that she deserved more than the heartbreak Maximilian had caused her, and she was ready to embrace a future that held promise. The scars would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. She was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than she had ever been. Maximilian, on the other hand, was trapped in a life of consequences. His future was uncertain, and the emotional turmoil he carried would follow him for the rest of his days. He knew that he might never be able to repair the damage he had done, and the thought of facing a life without love, without connection, was too much to bear. His journey was one of self-destruction, a road that seemed to have no end. And yet, as he sat alone in his mansion, he understood that the cost of his success had been far greater than he had ever imagined. The future he had built for himself, the life he had sacrificed everything for, was now a broken and empty shell. Maximilian withdrew from the spotlight, seeking the solitude he had long avoided. He retreated from his high-profile life, hoping that in the quiet, he might find clarity. The mansion that had once been a symbol of his success now felt like a prison. In the silence of his self-imposed isolation, Maximilian confronted the consequences of his actions. Long nights were spent in self-reflection, a painful process of revisiting the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt, and the emotional neglect that had torn apart the relationships he once held dear. As the days passed, he began to see the hollowness in his choices, the ways in which his obsessive pursuit of success had cost him the only thing that truly mattered: love, connection, and authenticity. He had devoted himself to building an empire, but in the process, he had destroyed the very things that could have given him true fulfillment. His realization that the relationships he had neglected, particularly with Isabella, were the ones that could have made him whole was a crushing blow. The regret and remorse that flooded him were intense, yet they gave birth to a powerful desire to change, to make amends for the damage he had caused. It marked the beginning of his personal transformation, a painful but necessary journey toward redemption. Maximilian began reaching out to those he had wronged, attempting to repair the emotional damage he had inflicted over the years. Each conversation, whether with family, employees, or old friends, was a step toward healing, though it often felt like an insurmountable challenge. His reconciliation with his family was bittersweet. They were cautious, skeptical of his newfound sincerity, but over time, they saw glimpses of the man he could become, a man willing to acknowledge his faults and make the necessary changes. But the most difficult part of his journey was reaching out to Isabella. She had been the one he hurt most deeply, and the thought of her rejection paralyzed him with fear. Still, Maximilian understood that if he truly sought redemption, he had to confront the person whose forgiveness mattered the most. His desire to make things right led him to plan a grand gesture, a way to show Isabella that his transformation was not just an empty apology but a true expression of change. He knew that his wealth and influence could not impress her, but he could use them to honor her, to celebrate her art and her worth as a person. Maximilian arranged a private art exhibition, one that would showcase Isabella's work in a setting far removed from the distractions of his usual lavish events. It would be intimate, meaningful, and focused entirely on her. As part of the gesture, he prepared a heartfelt speech in which he would open up about his past mistakes, acknowledge the pain he caused her, and express his deepest love and regret. He hoped that through this act, she would see the sincerity of his transformation. Isabella, upon hearing of Maximilian's gesture, was torn. The memories of their past flooded back, and her heart ached at the thought of what could have been. Yet, the wounds of betrayal ran deep, and she was unsure if she could ever forgive him for the pain he had caused. She was moved by the thoughtfulness of his gesture, the sincerity behind it, but the scars of their relationship were not easily erased. The trust between them had been shattered, and she wondered if it was possible to rebuild it. Still, despite her inner turmoil, Isabella decided to meet Maximilian one last time. She knew that this meeting would define whether or not she could let go of the past and move forward. She needed to hear the truth, to see if the man standing before her was the one she had once loved or someone entirely different. The decision to meet him wasn't easy, but it was a step toward finding closure, whatever the outcome. When they finally came face to face in the quiet, intimate setting of the exhibition, the air was thick with emotion. Maximilian, standing before her with vulnerability and rawness, spoke from the heart. He admitted his wrongs, shared his deep regret, and begged for forgiveness. The words were unpolished, but they were genuine. He had shed the emotional detachment that had once defined him, and in its place was a man who was not afraid to acknowledge his failures. Isabella listened, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She heard his remorse, saw the man he had become, and understood that he had changed. But the pain he had caused her was not so easily forgotten. There was a silence between them, one that stretched on as Isabella pondered what to do. It was a moment of reckoning, a time to decide if she could allow herself to trust again, if she could find it in herself to forgive. After what seemed like an eternity, she made her decision. Isabella, after much contemplation, chose to forgive Maximilian, but it came with a crucial condition. Forgiveness, she told him, didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean that everything could simply be wiped away, but it did offer a chance for them to move forward. If he was truly committed to proving that his transformation was real, that it was not just an empty apology. Maximilian listened intently as she spoke, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The road ahead would not be easy, and he knew that actions would speak louder than any apology. He would have to prove, day by day, that he had truly changed, that he was not the same man who had once abandoned her. The path forward would be fraught with challenges, but it was a path that held the possibility of healing. As Isabella offered her forgiveness, Maximilian felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew that their relationship could never be the same, but perhaps it could be something new, a love rebuilt from the ashes of the past, forged through honesty, patience, and mutual respect. With Isabella's forgiveness came the opportunity to begin again, to start anew and rebuild what had once been broken. Maximilian and Isabella began the slow and tentative process of rebuilding their relationship. It was neither quick nor easy. The scars from their past lingered, and there were moments when doubt crept in, both from Maximilian, unsure if he was truly deserving of her trust, and from Isabella, wondering if their love could truly be revived after all that had happened. But they both committed to the journey, recognizing that rebuilding trust would take time and effort, and neither of them was willing to give up without trying. For Maximilian, this meant proving every day that his love for Isabella wasn't driven by guilt or the need for redemption, but by the genuine connection they had shared once and could share again. He worked to show her that his transformation wasn't a temporary fix, but a lasting change. He let go of the old habits that had driven him to put his career and status above everything else, instead making time for her, for their relationship, and for the things that truly mattered. As the weeks turned into months, Maximilian learned to open up in ways he never had before. He shared his vulnerabilities with Isabella, something he had long avoided in his life, and in doing so, he allowed himself to be truly seen. He gave her space to heal at her own pace, respecting her boundaries and the need for time. It was a delicate balance, one that was often tested by the remnants of their past pain. But through it all, they moved forward together. Isabella, too, found herself slowly healing. The wounds from their past would never fully disappear, but they no longer controlled her. She focused on her art, pouring herself into her work with renewed purpose. Her art had always been a reflection of her emotions, but now it was imbued with a deeper sense of strength. Each stroke of the brush was a step toward reclaiming her sense of self, a testament to the woman she had become in the aftermath. For Isabella, healing also meant rediscovering her own worth outside of the relationship. She realized that while Maximilian had been a pivotal part of her life, she was not defined by their past. She was her own person, capable of growth and independence. She found fulfillment not just in her art, but in her ability to stand on her own 2 feet, to find peace within herself, and to embrace the future that lay ahead. Maximilian, too, began to see life through a new lens. His transformation was not just about mending his relationship with Isabella, but about redefining his own existence. No longer was he defined by his wealth, his status, or his business success. He had spent so many years chasing external validation, but he now understood that true fulfillment came from nurturing meaningful connections. His life was richer not because of the empire he had built, but because of the people he cared about and the love he had found again. As time passed, their bond grew stronger, though the shadows of their past were never fully gone. They both understood that love wasn't about erasing mistakes, but about growing through them. They worked together to build a new foundation, one that was grounded in honesty, vulnerability, and mutual respect. Maximilian's love for Isabella became a quiet but constant presence in his life, no longer driven by the need to prove himself, but by the deep, unconditional connection they shared. Isabella, in turn, embraced the love he offered, not as a redemption for his past mistakes, but as a testament to the man he had become. The final moment between them was one of quiet hope, a shared understanding that their journey wasn't over, but that they had both chosen to face the future together. As they sat side by side, no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, they looked forward to what lay ahead. The road was still uncertain, and there would be challenges, but they now faced them as equals, as 2 people who had learned to love in ways they never had before. Their love, born out of pain and struggle, was stronger for it. It was no longer just a love that existed in the good times, but one that had been tested and forged through adversity. Together, they had rebuilt what had once been broken, and in doing so, had created something far more enduring. The final lines of their story didn't offer any grand promises or assurances, but they did offer something far more meaningful: the understanding that love, when nurtured with care and commitment, has the power to overcome even the most painful of pasts. And as Maximilian and Isabella sat there, together in the quiet of that moment, they both knew that the future, whatever it held, was one they would face side by side. Their love, reborn from the ashes of the past, had the potential to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and they were ready to embrace it, one step at a time.